At one point, it got so bad and I just felt no one understood that I lost it. And I almost sort of tried to throw myself from a moving vehicle at one point, just because I felt like no one was taking it seriously, how stressed out I felt.
Are you working 50, 60, 100-hour weeks, trying to grow your business, but feeling burnt out, lonely, anxious?
The quality of your life is based on the quality of your relationships.
Today, we're learning from Sophie Scott, a founder who's now giving therapy to other founders because she's experienced the pressures that come with this job. You're going to learn about the 4 existential crises that put founders in therapy and what the warning signs are. Sophie shares a few anonymous examples about how others have handled these crises and how you can deal with them before it's too late.
Generally, I believe that people enter therapy when...
Sophie, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so obviously reason I want to have you on is, well, multiple reasons. One, we're friends. It's nice to hang out with a friend and an excuse to talk about more serious things because we usually just mess around and chat absolute garbage. Well, you do, obviously, and I listen. But you have been a founder and I've obviously spent time with you during your experience as a founder. I was experiencing mental health challenges. You were experiencing mental health challenges. We obviously connected about this. You already previously to being a founder had a background and experience in psychology. So that's my context for why I talk to you about this kind of stuff. I'd like you to share who you are in your own words. You know, what's your experience? Why should people listen to you?
Okay, sure. So these days I'm a psychotherapist. I have a private practice in London, working with clients online and also at my clinic. And I'll go into kind of like what therapy is about and my credentials in a moment. But as you said, I was a former founder. So I have a wide range of clients, but a lot are founders, probably because they know that I ran a wellness media startup called Balance for nearly 7 years. And so I had a lot of kind of highs and lows myself. I ultimately grew it to about 25 people. But, you know, it really took its toll on my mental health. And it's kind of ironic because, you know, here I was talking about mental well-being and really struggling myself. So yeah, I completely burnt out. I ended up in a psychiatrist's office, despite the fact that I was also, you know, training as a therapist. I wasn't yet a therapist, but I was training. I did a very long training. And at one point it got so bad and I just felt no one understood that I just lost it. And I almost sort of tried to throw myself from a moving vehicle at one point, just because I felt like no one was taking it seriously, how stressed out I felt. I'm not going to go into kind of like some of the reasons as to why that was, because I don't think that that's fully appropriate at this point. But
legally not advised.
Yeah,
understood.
But I have so much empathy for founders and, you know, can totally relate to as I said, the highs and lows of the journey.
Relating to some of the things you said, you know, as a founder in the wellness space, there's probably even more of an expectation and more of a surprise from people when you actually struggle with mental health or struggle with health in general. People sort of forget you're human, and there are these paragons of virtue and, you know, these amazing people we look up to in those spaces who on the surface always seem to be absolutely perfect, picture perfect in every kind of way. But they're actually people like us who still are human and still riddled by human psychology and the flaws of our own biology and mind. So
absolutely,
I think it's important to talk to people who work in that space as well. Because if the people who work in wellness still don't have it all figured out and don't have everything in balance, then what can we expect for your, you know, SaaS founder building a finance product who is really far removed from health information and even maybe self-awareness on the journey of managing their mental health, which is very important to stay the course.
Absolutely. And I think that, you know, what I found generally is founders, whatever like industry they're in, when they do come into therapy, even if they're, you know, completely burnt out, they're riddled with anxiety, they normally always still like glitter, you know? They've got this kind of effervescence about them. And they're just not all of them, but, they're so charming and kind of like lovable and warm that you don't really know that they're struggling. People around them, close to them, wouldn't know. And that's the thing, right? It's like you're able to put on such a good show for everybody else, and you've got to keep that up. And we'll talk about this more, getting a bit more specific. But, you put on such a good show for your team and for your investors and your board, and meanwhile, kind of really struggling yourself. So, yeah, I think it's important. It's always a bit nerve-wracking to admit that.
And also, like, physical disabilities are very, they're out there on show. Mental disabilities, sometimes, obviously, they're hidden, but actually sometimes they're hidden from yourself.
Yes.
And I remember when, there are some mental health problems I've had in the past that have been very clear to me. I had depression for a while. I knew I had depression. It was very clear to me. All my friends were telling me, and the way that I was behaving, I had the awareness to realize that was obvious. When I had insomnia, someone told me it was a mental health problem. I was like, no, I'm just not sleeping. It'll get better. It was like 6 months. And it really took someone to just sit me down and be like, you have a proper mental health problem. You have to go and do something about it. Here are some things to try, etc. For me to land the message. And that's someone who wasn't actually ashamed by the stigma of mental health at all.
Yeah.
And what that experience actually taught me is how insanely unself-aware you can be because of your overarching narratives in your head about what you're experiencing and normalizing that it's okay.
Exactly. And that's the other thing, is that I think, excitement and anxiety can feel very similar. It's like this adrenaline pumping through you.
Oh, sorry.
You need to poo.
Yeah, excitement, anxiety.
I see.
I don't need to poo right now if that's what you're asking. Yeah, no, I'm okay. Yeah, no, I don't usually announce that. No.
But, they can feel very, very similar. So actually, for so long, you might be feeling like you're just living this really adrenaline-fueled life. And okay, that involves ups and downs. But, there's something really like sometimes fun about it and certainly addictive, right? And so I think it takes building that self-awareness and actually really getting in touch with your body and recognizing kind of like bodily sensations and what's happening to decipher whether it's kind of like good stress or bad stress, right? Whether it's something that's motivating you and, you're growing from it and you're being challenged, or whether your energy is starting to deplete and you're getting these kind of weird signals from your body that something's not right.
On that topic,
yeah.
I find that, now with Heights, we sell probiotic. And that experience, you do, exactly. The experience I've learned from that, from customer feedback and everything else, and also myself being a customer of it, realized that men and women, very different understanding of listening to their body. And the reason I mentioned this with the probiotic particularly is obviously it's about pooing. And
your favorite subject.
Well, it is today, apparently. And it's really interesting. Women are way more in tune with their bowels and their sensations, and the reviews they leave and all of these things are like, it's like people leave reviews that seem wise almost, right? The insight around it is fascinating. Men don't notice this stuff so much at all, including their bowel movements. It's just like a job to be done, it gets done however long it takes kind of thing. I've learned through the experience of customer iteration that women understand how to feel their body and their sensations so much more than men, which going further down the road of why, actually obviously because periods. And so you literally every month you are in complete like sensation overload of understanding what's going on, and men don't have that. And so moving downstream of that, when you say it's in your body and feel it in your body, a lot of our listeners are men, obviously. You might hear that as a man and be like, sounds like woo-woo garbage to me. But I think it's a really important thing to lay on, because I think that, again, maybe the most surprising thing that I learned from reading The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, which I love. That book is all supposed to be about the mind, the now, etc., etc. 75% of his messages, it's your body. Listen to your body. And he does a really great job of explaining it. And so I think that's the really interesting thing that I'd like you to just explain a little bit more, because how is what's going on in your mind something that you can feel in your body, and especially if you're a man? And you're not, especially if you're a man, you're just
Yeah.
not in tune with your body.
Yeah.
Because most of us are not.
Yeah.
What are we supposed to be looking out for?
Well, let's just think about this for a second. So 95% of the brain's activity is unconscious, right? So that's a huge proportion, right? So those are your thoughts, your feelings, your dreams, and that includes like the things that are going on in your body, the sensations. We're just not aware of any of them. And so if we can start to come out of our mind, right? Because we don't know really what's going on there anyway, and start to bring mindful attention to the breath. And even now, if we do it, there's something called resonance frequency breathing, which I use a lot with clients. Really simple. It's 5 breaths in. Hold for 5. Out for 5. And I'll talk about client examples in a moment, but what happens is the nervous system goes into hyperarousal a lot of the time. So, in other words, you probably know about fight or flight, right? Which is the sympathetic nervous system. And most of the time when we're very stressed out or when we have, let's say, like prolonged stress, even though it may not feel stressful all the time, we don't go back enough into rest and digest. In fact, we can become completely, rest and digest can become completely alien. And that's when you literally can't rest. You cannot sleep. You cannot digest, so you can't eat, you lose your appetite. And so what we want to do is we want to try and notice our behavior. If, for example, we can't sleep, we can't eat, we can't concentrate because we can't focus on tasks, because our body's not in rest and digest, we need to reset the nervous system. And we do that through lots of ways, and maybe we can even do some throughout the episode. But the first one, the most important, is through the breath. And if we do that on an ongoing basis, we detach from all the kind of garbage in our mind and we pick up on what's going on in the body, and that is the gateway into the unconscious.
And unconscious sounds bad, but it's good.
No. I mean, unconscious can feel scary for people, right? But it's also where the gold is.
Right.
So, really the kind of the main reason to have therapy is to make the unconscious conscious. And, if we think that it's 90% of what you perceive right now is based on your past experiences, that's like crazy, right? So if you're not conscious of like what your past experiences were, what the scripts you've got in your head are, the things that you're passed on by your family, traumas, etc., then you behave unconsciously, like a lot of the time, and you tie your own shoelaces and you block yourself. So that's kind of the focus of therapy, is to unlock the unconscious. And yet there may be some dark stuff there, but there's also some gold. Like we always say, whatever's in the light, there's also a shadow of equal proportion, right? But the gold is in the shadow. And, if we think about founders, so if you think about like their light and shade, which we've all got. So a founder, what's a great quality of a founder? Like being an overachiever.
Excited. Yeah.
Okay. So if you're all of those things, right? You're an overachiever, you're innovative, you can achieve like amazing things and create change in the world. But the shadow of that is a loss of like personal relationships or a loss of your own well-being. And if you can't find a way to look at both sides of the coin, that's when like a distortion happens, right? So to simplify it in therapy, there's 3 stages. So the first is like knowledge, so building self-awareness. The second is through like behavioral change. So we do things like experiments and be like, okay, can you like just try doing this thing a bit differently for the time being? And then the third is integrating those things. So you integrate your knowledge and you integrate behavioral change. So that assimilation, you can bring it to your life and let other people around you know. And then that leads to can lead to lasting change, but it's a practice. Sorry, I'm sort of going into what therapy is.
Well, actually, let's go back to that. I mean, obviously everyone's heard of therapy or whatever, but I think because everyone has, they don't really attach what it really is. Just sounds like this thing that might be something that people should do. What is therapy?
Yeah.
Why is it important? And why specifically should entrepreneurs care about it?
So, I mean, in practice, it's going to the same person, usually at the same time every week to talk about whatever was going on in your life. But because of the fact that, as I said, the vast majority of the way we interpret today is based on the past, we do look back at the past, but always with a view to what will help you unblock yourself and get out of your own way in the present, and very much looking at the future as well. So I'm certainly a therapist that is future facing, not just all about the past, right? And then the relationship is really important. So I know it sounds really, really weird, but these all sorts of mysterious things start to happen within the therapeutic relationship because the client and indeed the therapist can project a lot onto each other. So as a therapist, you're usually cast as the client's kind of primary caregiver, so their parent. And so the relationship that they have with them, whether that's good or not so good, plays out. And so there is a kind of opportunity for healing and reparenting to happen, which is super interesting. But kind of maybe I've gone a bit too deep there. I think why it's so valuable is because even if you've got people in your life, and hopefully you do, that you can talk to, people close to you are still very invested in the outcome. People are still judgmental and biased, understandably so. But if you go to a therapist, it's a totally non-judgmental space. So you get to really explore that shadow part of you, the part that might have really dark thoughts or thoughts that wouldn't be welcomed by your husband or wife or whoever. And it's such a privilege as a therapist, working with people and getting to know their innermost world and secrets. And it allows a very intimate type of relationship to unfold.
To challenge that, how intimate can it be if you know nothing back of the other person?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question. So I think my view actually is that therapy is starting to change and should change, and I'm kind of trying to push it in that way a bit more. So doing an interview like this and revealing what I did at the start, Freud or whatever wouldn't have done that. Yeah. But I think that being completely faceless and nameless actually isn't that valuable because people feel threatened to open up anything about themselves, or their defenses come up more. Obviously wouldn't reveal loads of stuff, and I think some things are helpful and some things aren't. But you're right, it's a unique relationship. But then if it was the same as meeting a friend in a pub, it's like a private piece of theatre.
Okay, so that's what therapy is and how you approach it.
Yeah.
Why do founders need it?
So, founders generally come when they're in a crisis mode. There's not a lot, there's a good proportion that come because they have just deep curiosity about who they are. They want to get to know themselves better. And I think it's really important to say that as well. And they stay in therapy. So, if you know yourself better, you do better, right? So that's the first thing to say. But founders come into therapy and need therapy because they're shouldering an awful lot. It's a hugely stressful lifestyle choice to make. I mean, lifestyle choice makes it sound like it's you're going to be vegan, but it's hugely stressful. It's 1 in 3 founders suffer from depression. That's, I know it's a stat. Well, they say that 5% of the world population suffers from depression, which seems low.
Does
right?
seem low.
Yeah. I mean, if you ask me, everyone looks depressed.
True. That might be because you're in England in the winter.
On the tube. But seriously, like there's a huge disparity there. And it's kind of surprising.
So it's 6 times more than the average.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
so it's 30% to 5%. Yeah. So, and that seems kind of unlikely if you think about it, because we know that purpose, like having a purpose and having, you know, a reason to get up in the morning is usually an antidote to depression. So what is that? Is it cause or is it effect? I don't think it's a clear-cut answer. I don't know what your experience is. Is it that those with depressive-like characteristics may be more likely to end up as founders? Or is it that, you know, the ups and downs kind of lead someone to feeling depressed or even suicidal? I mean, there's been a lot of really high-profile kind of suicides, or at least kind of presumed suicides. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think certainly at the upper level of success, two things seem to happen. You know, I've spoken to many guests on this kind of stuff as well. I mean, if you go to the top level, I just read the Elon Musk biography. Have you read it?
I haven't read it, and I was curious to ask you.
I mean, he's clearly riddled with deep mental health problems. I mean, he's also like autistic, self-diagnosed, but you can see that in his interactions, it's quite clearly true. He's quite clearly, basically the whole narrative in the Elon book in general is that he is someone who, when things are going well, cannot handle it. Like if things are going really well, he has to ruin his life and find a new challenge. And that is exactly why he bought Twitter. Like after all reading the book, and you're so happy for him to have solved all these problems finally with Tesla and finally with SpaceX, and then the guy buys Twitter and ruins his life. It's destructive, and everyone around him is like begging him not to, including all the people he listens to, because they see the pattern, and he does it anyway, and it's ruined his life, and he hates it. He's so resentful for having done it. But that's just his pattern. So, you know, from that level down at the top level, there's a sort of psychosis to believing you can change the world.
Yes.
I think that's like quite an unhinged thought.
Yeah.
There's this sort of weird mix between confidence and humility that's sort of like this odd like imbalance in your personality in the first place.
Well, I think that's really interesting, because being a founder does kind of support bipolar behavior, you know, these kind of like huge highs and lows. And then, you know, like society celebrates busyness and productivity, but who's there when there is a crash afterwards? And I think that's when people may come to therapy. But often the person themselves doesn't like that version of themselves, you know, the version that can't get out of bed or is totally exhausted and depleted. Sorry to have interrupted you, but I think it's I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah. Well, going back to the point though, on who goes to therapy. So the only time I did therapy, and this is going to sound surprising to you maybe, but as you know, I deeply research and am fascinated by mental health things in general. So I've read tons of books, plenty of self-help, and I have no shame on self-help. I mean, that's basically the summation of summary of many self-help books up there. I find them very valuable. I take lots of lessons, loads of notes. This tablet is like full of those notes. I've only been to therapy once for like a period during COVID, like a lot of people, I'm sure.
As in one session?
No, but one period of time.
How many sessions?
Like 6 or something, which comes back to actually sort of my point. It's probably not enough. It's enough to know that you don't really vibe with your therapist. I think it's a very hard thing to get right. I just was unimpressed. Same thing happened. I've done relationship therapy with my wife, and we just weren't that impressed with our relationship therapist. We kind of stopped. I've never really found a person that I felt was right for me. And one of the challenges, I think, when you're a founder is investing in yourself properly around health and all of the things that you should do, even though you know you should do it. It's difficult to spend the money on yourself doing those things. And then it's very hard to be like, is it that therapy isn't right for me, or have I not found the right person? And how much money do I need to throw into this burning pile of cash fire pit to find the right person? Or is the right person out there? Do you know, there's this kind of, I guess I'll give you some of the obstacles you'll face in a potential customer wondering about therapy, right? Because that is totally my thing. I think I've got luckier with coaches, but I've got unlucky with therapy. And so I've never maintained it. And it doesn't mean I don't think I need therapy. In fact, I'm relatively of the belief that I'm sure everyone needs ongoing therapy. However, not found my person.
Sorry, how many therapists have you met with?
Well, only 2.
Right, okay.
Tiny. But I'm giving you literally, I suppose this is a perfect example of a typical busy founder's journey into therapy, right?
Yeah.
I tried, I stuck with it. I was like, nah, it's rubbish. Tried someone else, did a couple of sessions. I was like, no, I'm not getting anything from that. Is the problem me? Is it them? Is it your industry? And how do we make that work?
Yeah.
Therapy and founders, how are we going to find the right people?
It's a good question.
And commit to the investment.
Yeah, it's one that I'm kind of like toying with aside from this on a more kind of business level. But it's also not a straightforward answer because I don't know enough about even though I know you pretty well, I don't know enough about like your really deep material to know. Okay. So it could be that there's a dissatisfaction that's there. I'm going to start therapizing. You can project all you like. Yeah. It could be that there's a dissatisfaction that's there that can go on to anyone. It's kind of like this perfectionism. And unless someone is perfect, then it's best to just kind of like not go there. And that could be the work. So that could be really interesting to work with somebody who is like good enough. What does good enough look like for you? In fact, I've got an interesting anecdote about that later. So it could be that. It could be that simply you didn't get the right like referral or the right recommendation. Absolutely, it happens. And it is a little bit like dating. You've got to shop around and look for someone you trust, but also there's chemistry with and that you feel that you can learn stuff from.
And how many dates do you sleep with your therapist?
Yeah. Well, I think 6 actually is a good number. And then the other thing is, and this is something else that I have seen and experienced, is that you can get into a relationship that is actually like pretty dynamic and could be really healing, but that feels really scary for somebody. And so they can find an excuse or a reason to leave.
Got it. As in just sort of like they're suddenly about to have a breakthrough and it becomes too terrifying to really approach.
Yeah. Or that the intimacy and being kind of seen is too painful.
Okay, interesting.
But you're right. There is an issue, I think, with, like finding the right person. So maybe in the future we can talk about that.
I want to know, who are the type of people that do come to you? Like, what is a typical type of founder? What is a typical type of challenge? Yeah.
Well, obviously, everybody is different, but there are definitely certain characteristics. So we mentioned before kind of high-functioning, anxious types. I've also noticed that a lot of founders are self-made people. And by that, I mean that when we kind of dig into the past a bit, they've often taken like assumed responsibility in their family from quite a young age. Be that they've looked after a parent or siblings. They've kind of had to grow up quite fast. And then you can see that kind of playing out throughout the rest of their life.
Right, because the role as an entrepreneur is like nurturing team and stuff like that.
It's being the leader. Yeah. It's assuming responsibility. And it's interesting because we see that in kind of like world leaders as well. I think it's 12 US presidents lost a father when they were really young. And same with UK prime ministers. It's like really high proportion, 70 or something percent, high proportion have lost a parent before they were 16. So, I don't think it's a surprise that they've had kind of like a little bit of trauma. It kind of can build grit. But of course, it can also go the other way, just to say. But a lot of founders, I think, do have that grit and that self-reliance that you need, right, to start something. Generally, I believe that people enter therapy when they're struggling with a kind of existential concern.
What does that
They
mean?
obviously don't realize that they are. So there's the most wonderful US psychotherapist, and he was a Stanford psychiatry professor for many years, and author called Irvin Yalom. I don't know if you've read any of his books. No. Well, if you love therapy, if you love psychology and you love they read like more like novels. His best one is Love's Executioner. They're stories, basically. And he wrote a very important book in the mid-20th century that set out these kind of 4 main existential concerns. And they are, in short, death anxiety. So that's the fact that, like, from the moment you're born, you know you're going to die, but you don't know when and you don't know how. Like, that's anxiety provoking.
And that's when you should take a lot of psychedelics, right?
Right, yeah. Then there's isolation, which is the fact that you're born alone and you die alone. The third one is freedom. So, most of us living in the Western world, we're very fortunate. We have freedom of choice. But with that, there's a burden of like responsibility to make the right choice or the wrong choice. And then the last one is meaninglessness. That there's this threat always hanging over us that life is inherently meaningless and purposeless. And I think that the founder's journey kind of compounds, or let's say like accentuates, these existential concerns. So, no one comes to therapy and goes, oh my God, I've got death anxiety. But usually underneath whatever they're presenting with, I've found at least one of these existential concerns to be there.
How, when you're doing your therapy sessions, just to play devil's advocate on this, because this is a really interesting sounding framing, right? There's 4 existential threats. How much of when you're listening to someone talk about their stuff, are you trying to put them into one of those buckets that you might actually not notice they're not in any of them? Or are they like foolproof?
Great question. Nothing is foolproof. So quick background on me, I'm an integrative therapist. So I'm not a pure existential therapist. So maybe if you saw
None of this means anything to me. What do those things mean?
So I work with clients holistically. So I've like studied from Freud, so which is like clinical analysis, to stuff like body and breath work, like Eckhart Tolle, existential, which is what we're talking about now, Jung's, which is dreams. So there's lots of lenses to look through. So I would never, or I would try to never, I'm sure I fuck up. Yeah. I'm sure I mess up. Yeah. But I would try to never like impose something on somebody. But very often, I'd say in more cases than not, this applies, especially with founders.
Okay. Can you share some examples?
Yeah. Okay, so
it's really interesting.
Yeah,
like it's interesting conceptually, but I feel I have way more questions than I have answers at this point.
Yeah,
so take us through them a little bit.
Well, I will share some like client examples.
Yeah, obviously their name and their postcode.
Exactly. Their passport details. No, they're completely anonymized and often sort of conflated, bringing different people together to form an example. So let's take a guy, we'll call him Freddie, right? And he comes into therapy because, to be honest, I'm a bit surprised he does come into therapy. He is burnt out. He's on the brink of burnout. He is barely sleeping, barely eating. He's got headaches. His energy is kind of all over the place. He's running a Series A backed company. On the face of it, he's winning lots of accolades, he's getting lots of press, but behind closed doors, he hasn't got product market fit, and he's not going to be able to raise again, or he's going to really struggle. He's running out of money, and he obviously can't let his team know, so he feels like a total fraud, right? This is like a very common one that I see. And so, the first thing to do with somebody like this is to reset or help to reset the nervous system, because it's a bit like what we talked about at the beginning. He's so in hyperarousal, he can't really think straight for himself or for his company. So the beginning part of the therapy would be, practicing the resonance, frequency breathing, encouraging him. In fact, with Freddie, he took... he agreed he would take off like 3 or 4 days off work, would put an out of office on his email, would go and spend time in nature. And he had to do that to kind of be able to reset and gain some perspective. Because the goal was, right, how can you step out of being the founder for a minute and step into being like, if you were the NED for your company, like what would you actually advise? And you can't do that if you're in a state of hyperarousal. And then there's other things that...
Sorry, and that is simply because you're saying that they're not able to make clear decisions,
Yeah.
not able to think clearly in that state.
Correct.
Right.
Because in real life, you have to go between fight or flight and rest and digest. But if you can't and you're stuck in fight or flight, you're not making good decisions.
Right.
So breathing, establishing things like safe space or safe place visualization. There's like various tapping. I don't know if you know EFT and like...
I know some of these things, but regardless, can you just little explanations of each of these things?
Yeah, of course. So safe space, we can do it quickly. I don't know how much time we have. So we can do a short version, which is, if you're closing your eyes, connecting with the breath, making sure the exhalation is just that bit longer now than the inhalation. And I'm going to ask you to bring to mind a safe place. It might be somewhere in nature. It might be somewhere that's familiar to you, somewhere in your house, somewhere where you feel you can just be you, drop any masks, noticing your surroundings, what you can see, touch, maybe smell. Notice if anyone's with you. And to be able to take yourself to that place. And now slowly we'll bring some sensation into it. Stroking the palms. Just rubbing your palms very slowly together. Really feeling the hands, fingers. Staying in that safe place. You're starting to bring your hands up to your forehead. Just gently stroking out. It's like you're smoothing out the lines on your forehead. You might go up to your hairline. Okay. Normally we would carry this on and start to stroke down the body, like you might stroke your cats down the length of the arm. And you put yourself in a safe place. And you start to notice, if you practice things like this, you can open your eyes because we won't go into it properly, but if you start to practice things like this, frequently, you do start to lower your limbic system. Yeah, you start to be able to reset things. And that's really important before you do any work or make any big decisions, okay?
Question on that.
Yeah.
When I do a practice like that, that's a perfect example of something that you could do at home.
Yeah.
But founders like myself, bad at discipline, of self-care, of things like that. And ironically, the only place where they will go and do it is spending the money, being with a therapist, having the space and the structure, and being told what to do in that space.
Yeah.
And is that a very common thing?
Very common. That's why we all set New Year's resolutions, and by March or something, we've given up on them.
Yeah.
It's fine. We've got to forgive ourselves, right?
Yes.
So that's the first piece of work.
Yeah.
And then with Freddie, what was happening is that, like, when Freddie came, he seemed great to me. Like, he was super charming. I couldn't really sense that anything was off. It took a couple of sessions before he really started to talk about how he felt like his house was burning down around him. Before I could really get a sense of the person kind of like behind the mask. And well, we'll come on to that. But that was part of the problem, right? Is that his like world-facing persona and his authentic self were like worlds apart, right? So he had death anxiety. And he had it really bad, right? He could absolutely feel like his business was burning down around him. His dream was burning down, like a part of who he was dying. And that filled him with tremendous anxiety, understandably. Like what was going to become of him, of his legacy, this thing that he'd built.
And I suppose with these things as well, it's quite a slow, painful death that you sort of refuse to accept because you try and do anything, raising money and all of the things to get out of it.
Right. He wasn't, and this is the thing, he wasn't actually acknowledging that he had death anxiety, that he was petrified of his company going. And when he started to, and he calmed his nervous system down, he was able to start to make better decisions, actually. And ultimately, he ended up being able to do a kind of a flat round, and he had to make some difficult decisions, but he pivoted the business because AI had made a lot of like what he was doing kind of redundant. But it was only when he faced the death and stopped pretending to be this like all singing, all dancing guy, and even at board meetings, like trying to keep up appearances, that actually his own anxiety started to diminish, and he was able to take some like proactive, useful steps. And it was interesting because it tied into his own experience. So early on, he'd lost his parent, he'd lost his mum, and he had assumed responsibility really early on in his family. So he'd like looked after, I think he had 4 siblings, and he'd looked after them all. And he went back to school really quickly. And there was this sense that he never faced his mum's death. So now when he was faced with another death, he also wasn't looking at it. And so through starting to, and this is the thing with these existential concerns, when you actually face them and process them, it makes things much less scary and you can behave in a much more conscious way. So his previous experience was being re-triggered in the present, but this time we did something different and he was able to not have to keep up appearances. So it also ties into isolation, which was another of the concerns. So he always felt very alone because what he presented to the world and kind of what was really going on was so far apart. And so through the therapy, we helped him kind of bridge that gap. And that involved him being, okay, he couldn't really be more open and honest with his team members, but actually with his investors, with his board, he could be. And actually he needed to say, help, not literally help, but like, this isn't working. I need to get real here. Like the business is not looking good. And this is this is what I'm going to do about it, rather than painting a pretty picture all the time. And it's something that I've actually witnessed with you, Dan, like the way that you're building like heights in public. I mean, maybe it brings a whole new level of anxiety because you're doing it publicly, but I also think it must reduce a lot of your anxiety because you're not hiding. Yeah. So that becomes part of the work, that he doesn't have to feel so alone.
I've been thinking a lot about victimhood and about narratives and in society and all of this kind of stuff. It seems to me like the only class left of human beings that people are unable to logically feel sorry for are the wealthy. A lot of those people in entrepreneurship anyway are self-made from rags, right? Rags to riches. And as soon as they have privilege and wealth, no matter what they do in society, whatever, if they're feeling bad or if they're having mental health problems and stuff, people are very unkind and cruel to them because now they have money. So it's like, weirdly, the last remaining stigma that it's totally okay. Like everything else is now off bounds and, like cancel culture if you don't care enough about that person, but not if you're rich or wealthy. So an exited founder, which is very commonly my guest on Secret Leaders and stuff, they share things. I have real genuine empathy for them because they're human beings. I also happen to know that a lot of people don't and think, well, fuck you, you've got money, so it can't be that bad. Discuss.
So, yeah, I actually think that exited, quote unquote, successful founders material is often not that dissimilar from founders whose company has failed. That they're often both left with this sense of, well, what now? Like, where should I go from here? What do I want my life to look like? What actually do I value? So I think...
So the key questions that come up are still similar.
Correct. Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. So, to take an example of an exited founder, so we'll call her Georgina. And she came to therapy around 3 months or so after she'd exited. And she described looking at her bank balance and seeing this enormous lump sum in there, and it being like a really weird feeling. I think she went shopping the day after and like forced herself to buy some overpriced luxury goods. She gave a bunch of money to her parents, and then she kind of was like, now what? She had offers, like opportunities for things, but she was turning everything down. I think she didn't want to make the wrong decision, commit herself to something new. She'd run the startup for 9 years. So she was overcome by a kind of paralysis, right? So the existential concern that she was really struggling with, there were a few, but was kind of like meaninglessness. So she'd achieved this thing that she'd set out to do, but actually it kind of didn't really make her feel any different. There was this hole still there that needed to be filled, right? And she also felt like untethered and a lack of identity, because for so long, and this is so common, right? Like we subjugate who we really are often for our company. And you see artists do this as well. Like I've heard amazing interviews with Jim Carrey. He talks about this as well for his roles. And it's like the root to suffering, yeah? And that's when depression comes about as well, because it's like we have, like, depression is depressed feelings. So you're pushing down your feelings and you're basically like acting a part. So here she was, and she'd achieved the thing that she'd really wanted, but why did she ever really want this? So we examined, not to have regrets, but it's also okay to acknowledge your regrets or to examine them, right? And so she was very honest about the fact that probably a lot of it was for like the big PR story at the end and like what other people would think about her. So in terms of like, it was a broad extrinsic motivation, right? In fact, Matt...
To demonstrate value to the world.
To exactly. And there was such an interesting interview that I once saw with Matt Damon, who talked about the moment he won the Oscar for Good Will Hunting, and he was young. I don't know how old he was, but he was like early 20s when he won it. And he said that he went away and he got home and he looked at his Oscar and he thought, oh my goodness, what happens if I hadn't actually got this Oscar until I was 95 at the end of my life? What a waste of energy and time I would have put into getting this Oscar all those years. And I think that that's like very, very powerful, right? Because we should do this because we enjoy the journey of it. I mean, I know it's like a very cliched thing to say, but when you do something for the outcome, especially when it's an extrinsic motivation, it will never lead to fulfillment. And I just thought it was such a powerful realization that Matt Damon had, right? Like, imagine if he'd pursued that path for 95 years and then he got there. I was like, what now? But actually, Georgina wasn't, she was, I think, 40 or something at the time. So she had the rest of her life as well to kind of like figure out what it was she wanted to do. And so we did kind of like a life review where we looked at the moments in her life that really had brought her great joy and deciphered from that what her core values were. I also like to work with archetypes. So she had been Jungian archetypes, but you see,
what are they?
Yeah,
well, what are they? Explain what a Jungian archetype is.
I'm going to, in the simplest terms, in like every fairy tale, you see there's the hero, there's the wicked witch, there's the jester, the wizard. And you see them in every fairy tale, in every novel, in every movie. It's these kind of like roles that exist within the collective.
Right? Sort of guides through the narrative.
Correct. But the idea is that we all have them around us all the time and kind of also within us. But usually we identify with one or two the most. And so for a long time, she was like the heroine or the hero. Yeah. She was always like on a mission and fighting and achieving. And
is that a typical predominant founder trait?
Yeah, it is. So they've got this bias to action.
Right.
And everything is about heroic action. And actually, for this period in her life, she needed to be much more like the explorer. And that meant not having an objective. So kind of like being okay in the discomfort of not being the hero, of not having a goal in mind. And one way that we did this is we did some exercises around like, it's de-reflection, which is when you don't think about yourself, but you think about what you can do for others or like how you can help somebody else. And it's a really nice exercise actually when you're feeling like very stuck in your own head. And what she realized through like lots of exploration is that she was actually really passionate about travel and kind of like overseas philanthropic stuff. And she ended up starting a nonprofit organization in the end, but some time afterwards. But she had to really toy with what like life's inherent meaning was for her and where she would derive, where she derived her values from.
And what was her existential threat?
Meaninglessness and freedom, because she suddenly now had all of this freedom, right? You know, you've got all the money and you've got like no job to go to. But if you're not careful, that can feel very, very threatening because it's like, well, what do I do with my day?
Too much choice is very overwhelming.
Yeah. And so another thing actually that sounds really weird, but is setting a schedule. When you, let's say if you're in that position where you've suddenly got this kind of open wide, but you don't want to commit to new things, simply committing to, you know, a phone call with this person at 10 o'clock or, you know, a walk at 11 or was really important. So structure alongside this exploration was important. So yeah, those were the two kind of existential themes that she was struggling with.
Okay. I can see how freedom is probably the one that people have the least pity for, though.
Yeah.
Is that an overgeneralization? Like, do you agree or are you just placating me?
No, I think I hadn't thought about it.
Right, okay.
But I think you're absolutely right.
Because freedom is privilege.
Yeah, yeah. And so we should also touch on another thing that I am very aware of and have worked with some clients is like the lack of diversity in the ecosystem, right? And that can bring about a whole
in the
other
ecosystem, sorry, being in entrepreneurship.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that can bring about a whole other like set of like mental health struggles and feeling like literal imposter syndrome because I feel like I am an imposter.
Let's say I come to you or a patient comes to you and says, I feel trapped. Or you've diagnosed them. I suppose quite often you don't notice that you feel trapped. You've diagnosed the situation. Then what? What would you actually do?
Well, I think that we often feel trapped when we feel like people aren't aware of what it is we're struggling with, right? Like, as in it's a very lonely.
Right, you're shouldering stuff privately.
Exactly.
Okay.
So in a way, it kind of links more to isolation, right? So this one particular client, he felt isolated at work, running the scale up. He wasn't, as I said before, kind of like really enjoying it. He was terrified, he was reaching middle age. He was terrified that he was going to be irrelevant and replaced. And at home, his wife was clearly not happy with him. He'd missed his 2-year-old daughter's birthday party. His wife said, whenever you are at home, you're just constantly like on your phone. You're not even present. Even if you're there, present in body, you're not present in mind. And I worked with him, and the question that I usually ask first and foremost is this a familiar feeling to you? Or when else have you felt this way in your life? And what he realized is that this very much linked into the relationship that he had with his father. So his father was kind of there 1 minute and then kind of gone. He ended up being kind of quite ostracized from the family, actually because of his own like working life. And this guy, Simon, he was having this kind of like repetition compulsion. So he was repeating what had happened to him, and without being aware of it, was going to end up potentially in the same boat.
Got it. It's like a history repeating itself.
Exactly, like a history repeating itself.
Unconscious or conscious?
Totally unconscious until we joined these dots.
Right.
So one of the things that we did together is we did this a few times. We did a negative visualization, which sounds very kind of counterintuitive. But essentially it involves visualizing what it would look like if his wife did leave him, for example, and he really was ostracized from his kids, and really going into that and imagining it. And then we did the same thing with the company, and what happens if the company was really successful and you had this huge, exit at the end, or indeed if the company, you were replaced. And through kind of like facing his worst fears, he was able to start to redress some of his behaviors in the present day. And so because of that, he decided to improve his communication with his wife and with his family. And that was a way that he was able to like overcome the isolation. So silly things like being very disciplined with his phone, and we made contracts together in the therapy so that he would put his phone away by a certain point. In fact, he never brought it into the bedroom. He replaced it with a proper alarm clock. And then he would wake up 2 hours early and would go into the other room and would have like quiet time with a cup of coffee and would go through his emails and then would enjoy a family breakfast. It's like very simple stuff that suddenly made his relationship much better. Because here's the thing, right? The quality of your life, which is something Esther Perel says, is based on the quality of your relationships. And I would argue that it's even more so based on the quality of your relationship with yourself, because your external relationships are often a reflection of your relationship with yourself. Mm. And, there's no judgment here, but I'm always surprised with how few founders really do invest in their relationships. Like I was at Founders Forest, which is, the community that you set up, Dan. I was helping to run a group on how to raise happy and successful kids, which, by the way, are, not the same thing, right? And I was sharing the idea of being the good enough mother. So being able to take some pressure off oneself so that, actually your child needs to experience some setbacks, some failures, some disappointments in order to grow, right? And experience, some pain. It's important for them. And all the founders are absolutely, it's so important. Yeah. And I said, just out of interest, how many of you think it's okay for you to be the good enough CEO? Whoa, nobody. Yeah. So I know it's a difficult kind of pill to swallow, but actually, if you are, if you're a slave to your company, you haven't built a company, right? You've built yourself a job. Mm. So
you built a cage.
Yeah, you built a cage. And so through exercises like that, negative visualizations, through working out his values, improving his communication with his wife, because he realized how much he prized that really, and he did not want history to repeat itself for his kids. He was able to change things and make some also practical decisions within the business, which usually involved delegation.
So is part of the ambition almost for being a successful founder to be able to be comfortable accepting being a good enough CEO? Is that an aspirational position in your view?
I don't think it's an aspirational position to hold all the time, but I think it's necessary at points.
Why not? I guess I'm interested to challenge you further on that. As soon as you said it, I wasn't in that session. As soon as you said it, I was like, "Oh, that's quite uncomfortable, isn't it?" And then at the same time, I've been doing lots of research on success, specifically the science of success, the papers and everything else. There are a lot of school of thoughts that the epitome of success would be the idea of saying, good enough.
Yeah.
But you felt uncomfortable when I challenged you back with that statement.
Yeah, it's interesting because I suppose even, I'm a relatively new mother, and I don't go around all the time thinking, I'm just going to be a good enough mother. I'm just going to be a good enough mother.
But is that bad to be a good enough mother?
Not at all. But it's something I remind myself at points where I'm at capacity and I can't manage anymore, right? So it's a really good thing to fall back on. And ultimately, yeah, I think it probably is a good thing to aspire to. But I do understand that for a lot of people listening to this, it's not something that they want to have as a value on their vision board.
What are the reasons most founders go into therapy?
Well, it's different for everyone, but most of the time it links to one of the 4 existential threats, which are death anxiety, the fact that from the moment we're born, we know we're going to die, but we don't know when, which is a bit like a founder's company, right? There is isolation, which is the second one, which is the fact that you're born alone and you die alone. And we know that when you're running a company, you often feel alone most of the time, right? You can't really share with your team, and you can't often share with your board or your investors. The third is freedom, which is you have freedom to make choices, but with that comes an enormous burden of responsibility, especially over, your team's livelihoods. Big decisions that you have to make, have a much wider impact. And the fourth is meaninglessness. There's a threat that life is inherently meaningless. So what does that mean then for you in your life? How do you want to spend it? Are you putting your energies into the right company? Is your company putting its energies into the right place? Or does some change need to happen? Do you need to reevaluate?
What if I'm living through all 4 existential threats at the same time?
Come to therapy.
There is an amazing story that I love. It's one of my favorite. It's a very short one, but I think Joseph Heller had written Catch-22.
Okay.
And him and Kurt Vonnegut were at a private equity founder's $1 billion home. And apparently Kurt Vonnegut went up to Joseph Heller and said, you've just written one of the most successful novels in the whole world ever. But you'll never have all of this. And he said, well, I have something that money can't buy. I have enough. And it's such a great story, whether it's true or not, who knows. But it is an amazing reminder that the mindset of boasting, the mindset of having all of these things, it doesn't end. So therefore, how could you be happy? Therefore, how could you actually be successful?
Absolutely, because the more you have, the more you want.
And I guess that's the freedom mindset problem as well, right? The freedom existential threat. There's a lot of concepts, a lot of things in this. If there's one piece of advice that people need to take away to be more aware of their need for therapy or their mindset to be a better founder, what is it going to be?
It's going to sound like a really weird one, but keep your ego in check. Because I think that too many founders attribute their success or their failure down purely to themselves. And it kind of comes back to being good enough. I think we do much better, and certainly the happiest founders that I've met are the ones that realize that they were always on the precipice, and it kind of could have gone either way. You can't really determine the outcome. You can only ever do your best. And when you think of yourself more as a kind of co-creator, I think it leads to a much happier life. You can't determine the market. You can't determine some crazy thing that's going to happen in the world. And there's beauty to that too, right? Because that's where this serendipity comes in. That's where the magic is. So, yeah, perhaps not what you were expecting me to say, but not, yeah.
No, it makes sense as being, I guess, aware of the flow of the journey.
Yeah.
One way or another, which is hard. Like I say that as a founder, it is hard. I do attach my self-worth to the numbers, how many downloads, how much revenue, I can't help it. And those are not healthy behaviors. And yet I do them anyway. So how would you therapize me out of that?
Well, it's a really hard one. I'm not a hypnotist, but ultimately
thought you were a jack of all trades. You're Jungian, you're this, you're that. You're not a therapist. Stop at hypnotherapy, huh?
But ultimately, in therapy, we would work out, where is this coming from? Because not always, but often when we have this like insatiable ambition, it's because there's like a deficiency. Yeah, there's some hole. And sometimes it's not even ours. It's like something that we're living out for our parents.
Are all entrepreneurs ambitious?
I would say so.
Yeah. And is that a bad thing?
That's not a bad thing at all. I think it's a wonderful thing. But I think that if you're not aware of the shadow part, then it can become a distortion. It's like when we think of those existential concerns, they can either be dysfunctions, yeah, or you can use them to function better as a human being. And so my sincere hope for all of us, right? And I'm not sitting here saying that I've achieved these things. I'm talking about principles and
you are glowing with self-actualization.
The way that I work with clients, but it's just to keep doing the work and to take time out to reflect on yourself. Because at the end of the day, you are born alone and you do die alone.
Oh, that's your threat.
And the more you can be truthful with yourself, I think the more fulfilling your life ultimately will be.